Imagine stepping off a ship onto foreign soil after years of commanding armies across battlefields soaked in blood and fire. You have led thousands of men into combat, seen entire cities reduced to rubble, and witnessed the full horror of modern warfare. You have lived in a world where every resource was rationed, where entire populations went hungry, and where the machinery of war consumed everything in its path. You have been told again and again that your enemy lives in a nation struggling just as you are, suffering just as your people suffer, barely holding on against the might of your forces. And then, in one single moment, as you stand on American soil for the first time as a prisoner of war, everything you believed shatters like glass. The streets are filled with automobiles that seem to number in the millions. The shops overflow with goods you have not seen in years. The people walk past wearing clothes that look new and clean, their faces not marked by the starvation and desperation you know so well. The lights blaze through the night without fear of bombing raids. Food appears in quantities that seem impossible, almost obscene. This is the moment when German generals, some of the most powerful military minds of World War II, arrived in America as prisoners and felt their entire understanding of the war collapse beneath them. The journey of these German generals from the battlefields of Europe and North Africa to the prison camps of America represents one of the most psychologically devastating moments in military history. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were the men who had planned campaigns, who had studied maps and moved divisions like chess pieces, who had believed in their cause and their ultimate victory. They had been raised in a Germany that was told it had been betrayed after World War I, starved by blockades, humiliated by treaties, and crushed by economic disaster. They had watched Adolf Hitler promise to restore German greatness, to make their nation strong again, to reclaim what had been taken from them. Many of these generals had joined the military long before the Nazi Party came to power, serving in the old traditions of Prussian military excellence. They saw themselves as professional soldiers, not politicians, though the lines between the two had blurred beyond recognition as the war continued.
They had fought in Poland and France, in the Soviet Union and North Africa, and many had experienced victory after victory in the early years of the war. The shock they experienced was not merely about material wealth or industrial capacity. It was a fundamental psychological earthquake that forced them to confront the possibility that everything they had been told was a lie. If America possessed such overwhelming abundance, such untapped power, such limitless resources, then how could Germany have ever hoped to win? If the American people were not suffering, not starving, not on the verge of collapse as propaganda had promised, then what did that say about the information they had received from their own leaders? These questions haunted the captured generals as they were processed through American military facilities, transported to prison camps, and given their first real glimpse of American life. Some of them would spend years in captivity, watching through the wire fences as American society continued to function with an ease and prosperity that seemed to mock everything they had sacrificed. Others would be interrogated, studied, and debated with by American officers who wanted to understand how educated, intelligent men could have served such a regime. The German generals who would eventually find themselves prisoners in America came from a very specific world, shaped by history, tradition, and the traumatic experiences of their youth. Many of them had been born in the final decades of the 19th century or the early years of the 20th, growing up in the German Empire when it was one of the most powerful nations on earth. They had been raised in a society that celebrated military achievement, where the Prussian officer corps represented the highest form of honor and service. As young men, they had witnessed the catastrophe of World War I, either serving in it themselves or watching fathers and brothers march off to fight. They had experienced the shock of defeat in 1918, when the German military had been told they were winning right up until the moment the government collapsed and the armistice was signed. The years that followed brought humiliation and hardship that scarred an entire generation.
The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh terms on Germany, taking away territory, limiting the military to a tiny fraction of its former size, and demanding reparations that many Germans believed were designed to crush their nation forever. The economy spiraled into chaos during the early 1920s, with hyperinflation destroying the savings of millions and making money worthless almost overnight. Families that had been middle class found themselves impoverished, their security and status wiped away. The Weimar Republic that governed Germany during this period was seen by many as weak and illegitimate, unable to restore German dignity or prosperity. For the professional military officers who formed the core of the German general staff, these years were times of frustration and resentment. They believed their nation had been great and could be great again if only the right leadership could be found. When Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in the early 1930s, they promised exactly what many Germans desperately wanted to hear. They would tear up the Treaty of Versailles, rebuild the military, restore German pride, and reclaim the position Germany deserved among the nations of the world. For many generals, the Nazis represented an opportunity, even if they did not fully embrace the party's ideology. Hitler promised to expand the army, to invest in new weapons and technology, to give the military the resources and respect it had been denied. Many officers convinced themselves they could work with the regime, use it to rebuild German military power, and maintain their professional standards even as the political situation grew darker. Some genuinely supported Hitler's vision of German expansion and racial superiority. Others simply chose to focus on their military duties and ignore the regime's crimes. These generals lived in a Germany that was being rebuilt for war. Throughout the 1930s, factories were converted to military production, young men were conscripted and trained, and the entire society was mobilized around the idea of reclaiming German power. But even as Germany rearmed, it remained a nation with fundamental weaknesses. Germany lacked the natural resources that modern warfare demanded in enormous quantities. There was not enough oil to fuel the machines of war for a long conflict. There was not enough rubber, not enough certain metals, not enough food to sustain both the military and the civilian population through years of total war. The German economy, despite the propaganda about strength and efficiency, was built on a fragile foundation that required conquest to sustain itself. The entire strategy of Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that brought such stunning victories in the early years, was partly born from necessity. The generals planned their campaigns with maps that showed resources to be captured, territories to be seized, and populations to be exploited. They studied the weaknesses of their enemies and believed they could strike before those enemies were ready. When the war began in September 1939 with the invasion of Poland, the German military machine performed brilliantly. Poland fell in weeks. The following spring, Denmark and Norway were conquered. Then came the stunning victory over France, achieved in just 6 weeks, when the previous war had ground on for 4 years in the same territory. These victories seemed to confirm everything the generals believed. They were the best trained, the best led, the most innovative military force in the world. Their enemies appeared weak and divided. But even in these moments of triumph, there were warnings that few heeded. The British refused to surrender after France fell, and the United States, though officially neutral, was clearly supporting Britain with supplies and equipment. The Soviet Union, despite the non-aggression pact with Germany, was viewed with suspicion and fear. And always there was the question of resources, of how long Germany could sustain a war against multiple enemies, of what would happen if the quick victories stopped coming. Some generals raised these concerns, but Hitler and his inner circle dismissed them. They believed in willpower, in the superiority of German fighting spirit, in the weakness and decadence of their democratic enemies. They told themselves and their subordinates that America was a nation of mongrels with no stomach for real war, that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay, that the British Empire was crumbling and ready to collapse. The road to American captivity came differently for different generals, but it almost always followed defeat and the collapse of everything they had fought to build. For some, like the generals captured in North Africa after the surrender of German and Italian forces in Tunisia in May 1943, the capture came after months of grueling desert warfare, where supply lines had stretched to breaking and the Afrika Korps had been ground down by superior Allied numbers and resources. For others, capture came in the chaos of the final battles in Europe as the Third Reich crumbled in the spring of 1945, with Soviet forces closing from the east and American and British forces sweeping across Germany from the west. Some generals surrendered formally, walking out under white flags to meet their counterparts in the Allied armies. Others were captured in the confusion of retreat, separated from their units and picked up by advancing soldiers. The initial period after capture was often surreal and disorienting.
These men who had commanded thousands, who had been saluted and obeyed without question, suddenly found themselves armed and under guard.
They were searched, documented, and interrogated. Their personal belongings were cataloged and often confiscated. They were separated from their subordinates and placed with other high-ranking officers. Many of them expected harsh treatment, perhaps even execution, based on how prisoners were often handled on the Eastern Front and based on their own knowledge of how Germany had treated captured Soviet officers. But the Americans and British generally followed the Geneva Convention rules for prisoners of war. The generals were not tortured or starved. But being treated correctly as prisoners of war did not prepare them for what came next. After the initial interrogations and processing, those generals who were selected for transfer to the United States faced a journey across the Atlantic Ocean that would change their understanding of the world. They were placed on ships, often Liberty ships or other transport vessels that had been built in American shipyards in astonishing numbers. Even these ships were a revelation. The generals could see that these were new vessels, mass-produced with an efficiency that spoke to industrial capacity far beyond what they had imagined. During the voyage, which could take weeks depending on routes and weather, the prisoners had time to think, to talk among themselves, and to begin processing what had happened. Some remained defiant, insisting that Germany had only lost because of betrayal or bad luck. When the ships approached American shores, the generals caught their first glimpses of the new world through portholes or from the deck under guard. What they saw seemed impossible. The harbors were filled with ships, more ships than they could easily count, representing a merchant marine and naval force that dwarfed anything they had seen before. The cities visible from the water showed no signs of bombing damage, no rubble, no destroyed buildings. The lights at night blazed without blackout curtains, a sight that was shocking to men who had lived for years under the constant threat of air raids. As the ships docked and the prisoners were prepared for disembarkation, many of the generals felt a growing sense of unease. This was not supposed to be what America looked like. This was supposed to be a nation drained by war, struggling to supply its forces overseas, on the verge of exhaustion from the effort of fighting across two oceans.
The moment of stepping onto American soil marked the true beginning of the psychological shock that would define their captivity. The processing facilities at the ports were deficient and well-organized. There were American soldiers everywhere, well-fed, well-equipped, with uniforms that looked new and gear that was clearly abundant. There were vehicles, trucks and jeeps and staff cars, moving in organized streams that spoke to logistical capacity on a scale the generals had never truly grasped. The trains themselves were comfortable by the standards of wartime transport. They were not cattle cars. The prisoners sat on seats, looked out windows, and watched America pass by for hundreds or thousands of miles. And what they saw through those windows shattered assumptions. They saw cities that stretched for miles without a single bombed building. They saw factories with smokestacks pouring out production, not just a few factories, but complexes of industrial facilities that seemed to go on forever. They saw farms with modern equipment, vast fields of crops, herds of cattle that spoke to agricultural abundance beyond imagination. They saw highways filled with private automobiles, millions of cars owned by ordinary citizens, using gasoline freely while Germany had been rationing fuel desperately for military use alone. General Hans Kramer, who had commanded forces in North Africa and been captured there, later described his train journey across America as the moment he truly understood that Germany had lost the war before it had even begun. He watched through the window as the landscape rolled past, seeing abundance everywhere, and realized that Germany had been fighting an enemy with resources so vast that defeat had been inevitable from the start. Other generals had similar reactions, though some took longer to admit it even to themselves. They saw construction projects, new buildings going up even during wartime. They saw waste, food thrown away in quantities that would have fed German families for days. The prison camps themselves drove the point home even further. These camps were built specifically to house prisoners of war, and while they were certainly prisons with fences and guards, they were not designed to torture or deliberately deprive. The barracks were heated in winter and had running water.
The food provided to the prisoners was based on the same rations American soldiers received, which meant quantities and variety that many German soldiers had not seen even before they were captured. There was meat regularly, white bread instead of the dark bread mixed with sawdust that had become common in Germany, coffee and sugar, fresh vegetables. The camp canteens sold cigarettes and candy and small luxury items. For the generals, who were housed in special compounds separated from enlisted prisoners, the conditions were even more remarkable. They had access to newspapers and magazines, though censored for security. They could write letters home, though these were monitored. They were visited by representatives of the Red Cross, who checked on conditions. They were interviewed by American intelligence officers, who treated them as professional soldiers and engaged them in discussions about military theory and history. And through all of this, the underlying message was clear. Living in the American prison camps forced the German generals to confront the enormous gap between what they had been told about their enemy and the reality they were experiencing every day. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years painting a picture of the United States as a weak and decadent nation, a mongrel country with no real unity or strength, a place where capitalism had created a thin layer of wealthy exploiters ruling over masses of suffering poor. The propaganda had insisted that America's industrial capacity was exaggerated, that its people had no will to fight, that its society would collapse under the pressure of war. The generals had received intelligence reports that supported this view, carefully selected information that confirmed what the Nazi leadership wanted to believe. But now, seeing America with their own eyes, the generals could not escape the obvious truth that almost everything they had been told was a lie. The poverty of the Depression years had been real, but America had recovered and then mobilized for war with a speed and scale that had no parallel. The productive capacity was not exaggerated, but if anything had been underestimated in German intelligence assessments. The American people, far from being divided and unwilling to fight, had united behind the war effort and were sustaining it with a determination that showed no signs of wavering.
The generals watched as their guards rotated out, fresh young American soldiers replacing those sent overseas, and they realized that the pipeline of trained men seemed endless. They heard news of battles in the Pacific and Europe, where American forces were advancing despite fierce resistance. The psychological impact of this realization varied among the generals, based on their personalities and their level of commitment to the Nazi ideology. Some of them had been professional soldiers long before Hitler came to power, men who saw themselves as servants of Germany rather than servants of the Nazi Party. For these men, the recognition of their nation's strategic failure was devastating, but not incomprehensible. They could accept that Germany had made a terrible miscalculation, that the leadership had deceived itself and been deceived by its own propaganda. They could begin to process their defeat as a military and strategic failure rather than a racial or ideological one. Other generals, particularly those who were true believers in National Socialism, found the confrontation with reality far more difficult to accept. They had built their entire worldview around the idea of German racial superiority, the weakness of democratic societies, and the inevitable triumph of their cause. To admit that America was stronger, that its system was more effective, that its people were more united and capable than Germans, would be to admit that everything they believed was wrong. These men often retreated into denial or elaborate conspiracy theories. They insisted that Germany had only lost because of specific betrayals or mistakes, that if certain decisions had been made differently, victory would still have been possible. The camp debates among the generals became intense and sometimes bitter. They had time, endless time in captivity, to argue and discuss and try to make sense of what had happened. Some of the discussions were about military tactics and strategy, analyzing where specific campaigns had gone wrong and what could have been done differently. But the deeper discussions were about the fundamental assumptions that had guided German policy. Had they been wrong to trust Hitler's judgment? Had the ideology of National Socialism blinded them to reality? Had their own prejudices and beliefs about other races and nations caused them to underestimate their enemies? These were painful questions that cut to the core of their identities and their sense of honor.
The interrogations by American intelligence officers added another layer to this process of confrontation. The Americans were genuinely curious about how the German military had operated, how decisions had been made, how the relationship between the Nazi political leadership and the traditional military hierarchy had functioned. They asked detailed questions about specific battles and campaigns. They wanted to understand the German perspective on various strategic choices. And in these conversations, the American officers often challenged the assumptions and beliefs the German generals expressed. They pointed out the contradictions, the failures of intelligence, the ways that ideology had distorted military planning. Some of these interrogations were conducted by German-speaking American officers who could engage in sophisticated discussions about military theory and history. One particular source of shock for the generals was learning about the full extent of American industrial production. They were shown films and photographs of American factories, the massive shipyards that were launching a new Liberty ship every few days, the aircraft plants where bombers rolled off assembly lines faster than Germany could shoot them down, the tank factories producing the Shermans that would eventually overwhelm German armor through sheer numbers. They saw the statistics, the numbers that revealed America was outproducing Germany by factors of 2 or 3 or 5 in almost every category of war material. They learned that American factories were producing not just for American forces, but for the British, the Soviets, the Chinese, and other allies around the world. The generals began to understand that the war had been unwinnable from a purely material standpoint, that no amount of tactical brilliance or fighting spirit could overcome the vast disparity in resources and industrial might. Some of them felt a strange sense of relief at this realization. If the war had been unwinnable, then their defeat was not a personal failure, but a mathematical inevitability. Others felt betrayed by their own leadership, angry that they had been sent to fight a war that the Nazi high command must have known could not be won. They remembered the assurances they had been given, that the Americans would never be able to mobilize effectively, that the Soviets would collapse within months, that Britain would sue for peace once France fell.
The psychological journey from certainty to doubt to acceptance took different amounts of time for different generals. Some reached a point of clear understanding relatively quickly once they were confronted with undeniable evidence. Others resisted for months or years, clinging to fragments of the old ideology and the old certainties. A few never fully accepted that their cause had been wrong, maintaining until their deaths that Germany had been justified in its actions and had only lost due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. The time spent in American captivity became a defining experience that shaped the rest of these generals' lives and contributed to the larger story of how Germany would understand and remember World War II in the decades that followed. The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 did not mean immediate release for the prisoners. The process of repatriation was slow and complicated, tangled up in the beginnings of the Cold War and the division of Germany into occupation zones controlled by different Allied powers. Some generals remained in American custody for months after the war ended. Others were transferred to British or French custody. For those who were eventually allowed to return to Germany, the homecoming was often deeply painful. They returned to a nation that was physically devastated, divided among the occupying powers, and psychologically traumatized by total defeat and the revelation of the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes. The Germany they had fought for no longer existed. The cities they remembered were fields of rubble. Millions of Germans were dead or displaced. The economy had collapsed. Food was scarce, and survival was the primary concern for most people. Many of the generals who had experienced the shock of seeing America brought that experience back with them as a kind of knowledge that shaped how they thought about Germany's future. They had seen what a modern, democratic, industrial society could achieve. They had witnessed the efficiency of American systems, the productivity of American workers, the stability of American institutions. Some of them became advocates for Germany adopting similar approaches, for building a new Germany that would be integrated into the Western democratic world, rather than trying to stand apart as it had in the past. This was not an easy message to deliver in the immediate post-war years, when many Germans were more focused on survival than on political philosophy.
There was also significant resistance from those who did not want to hear that America or any of the Allied powers had been right about anything. The process of denazification, where the Allied occupation authorities tried to remove Nazi influence from German society, was complicated and often inconsistent. Some genuine war criminals escaped punishment, while others who had been relatively minor participants in the regime faced harsh consequences. In the western zones of occupation, particularly in what would become West Germany after the country was formally divided in 1949, the knowledge and perspectives of the returning generals played a role in shaping the new relationship between Germany and the Western powers. As the Cold War developed and the Soviet Union came to be seen as the primary threat, the Western allies became interested in learning from German experiences fighting the Soviets on the Eastern Front. Former German generals were interviewed and consulted about Soviet military tactics and capabilities. Some of them wrote memoirs and military analyses that were studied by American and NATO planners. The memoirs and writings produced by these generals in the post-war years often reflected the psychological journey they had undergone during their captivity in America.
Many of them wrote about the shock of seeing American industrial capacity and the realization that Germany had been fighting an unwinnable war. Some were quite explicit about how propaganda and ideological blindness had distorted their understanding of their enemies. Others were more defensive, arguing that they had been professional soldiers doing their duty and should not be held responsible for the crimes of the Nazi political leadership. The generals who had been imprisoned in America also carried with them a particular perspective on the Cold War division of Germany. They had seen the prosperity and freedom of American society. They knew what life was like in a democratic capitalist system. When Germany was divided and the eastern portion fell under Soviet control and communist rule, the contrast became even sharper. Some of the generals who settled in West Germany became outspoken advocates for Western integration and Atlantic alliance. They argued that Germany's future lay in partnership with the United States and the other Western democracies, not in neutrality or in any attempt to play the Eastern and Western blocs against each other.
The personal lives of these men in the post-war years varied widely. Some managed to rebuild successful careers, finding positions in business or as military consultants. Others struggled with the stigma of their service in the Wehrmacht and the SS, facing social ostracism or legal challenges. A few remained unrepentant about the Nazi regime and became involved in far-right political movements that denied or minimized German crimes. But many of them went through genuine processes of reflection and change, forced by their experiences in captivity and by the undeniable evidence of what the regime they had served had actually done. The story of these generals and their shock at seeing America also became part of the broader historical understanding of why Germany lost World War II. The material and industrial imbalance between Germany and the Allied powers, particularly the United States, was so vast that it raises the question of why German leadership ever thought victory was possible. The answer lies partly in ideology and partly in willful self-deception. The Nazi leadership believed what they wanted to believe about German superiority and enemy weakness. They built an intelligence apparatus that told them what they wanted to hear. They dismissed or ignored information that contradicted their assumptions. The generals who saw America with their own eyes and recognized the truth became witnesses to this fundamental miscalculation. Their testimonies, preserved in interrogation reports, memoirs, and historical interviews, provide valuable evidence for historians trying to understand the German perspective and the process by which the Nazi regime led Germany to catastrophic defeat. These men had been part of the military machine that conquered most of Europe and came close to defeating the Soviet Union. They had been educated, intelligent, professional soldiers, and yet they had served a regime built on lies and had believed those lies long enough to participate in terrible crimes and a destructive war. The legacy of this experience extends beyond the individual generals to the broader question of how societies confront propaganda and self-deception. The German generals had been part of a system that told them what they wanted to hear, that confirmed their prejudices and their sense of superiority, that promised easy victories and inevitable triumph.
When reality intruded in the form of American abundance and power, the psychological impact was devastating, precisely because the gap between belief and truth was so enormous. In the decades since World War II ended, Germany has undergone a remarkable transformation, becoming a stable democracy and one of the most prosperous nations in Europe. This transformation was built in part on the painful recognition that the Nazi period represented a moral and strategic catastrophe that required fundamental change. The generals who experienced the shock of seeing America, who lived through the collapse of their certainties and the confrontation with a reality they had not wanted to acknowledge, were part of the generation that had to make sense of this transformation. Some of them contributed positively to building the new Germany. Others remained obstacles, clinging to old beliefs and old justifications. But all of them carried the memory of that moment when they saw with their own eyes that their nation had been fed lies and had believed those lies to the point of self-destruction.